We're going back to Omri's paper, Omri Amiraz, a graduate student at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he will speak about negated quantifier phrase construction, typology, and diachrony. Omri, the floor is yours.
Yeah, can you hear me well? Right. Yeah, so I apologize for the delay and thank Dirk for switching with me. So this study investigates the typology of negated quantifier phrase constructions, such as not all of the students live in the dorms, where the negative marker is positioned before the quantify phrase. According to the results of the study, these constructions exist in about half of the world's languages. So many languages do not have such constructions. I argue that they historically developed out of an ellipsis construction called neg scripting, which is demonstrated by two. Some of the students live in the dorms, but not all of them. So in this case, too, the negative marker precedes the quantify phrase, but it's an ellipsis construction. The VP is elided. So I argue that the constructions like one, which are independent clauses, historically derived from ellipsis constructions like two. Negated quantifier phrase constructions are defined as follows: a monoclausal construction distinct from standard negation, in which a negative marker precedes a quantify phrase. So in the example we saw, not is positioned before the quantify phrase. Standard negation is a construction that is employed to negate main declarative unquantified verbal clauses, such as John doesn't live in the dorms. And so in this case, the subject is not a quantifier. And that's basically, you can say, the basic negative construction in English for verbal clauses. So for example, in English, in standard negation, not follows the auxiliary or copular verb, like Mary didn't see John. But when the subject is a quantifier phrase, not can precede it, and you can say not everyone saw John. In contrast, unquantified subjects, such as proper names, cannot occur in this construction. You cannot say not Mary saw John in the sense that Mary didn't see John. So only certain type of subjects can occur in the construction in 6. So we see that the negated quantifier phrase is distinct from standard negation in English. And in Ojibwe, it's not the case. The negative particle, Gawin, occurs either before or after the subject in standard negation. So if you want to say the man didn't see the woman, you can say man not saw woman, or not man saw woman. So the negative particle can either follow the subject or precede it in standard negation. Both options are possible. And unsurprisingly, you can also position the negative particle before a quantified subject. So for example, in this sentence, but not all obeyed the good news, and the negation precedes the quantifier. So given that in 9, this construction is not distinct from standard negation because this word order is also possible in standard negation, I do not consider it a negated quantifier phrase construction, unlike what we previously saw in English, that the two constructions differ. Why do languages have negated quantifier phrase constructions? Close initial negation is uncommon in the world's languages in standard negation. So in most languages, the negative marker doesn't occur in close initial position and precede the subject. In most languages, using standard negation with a subject quantifier requires an inverse scope interpretation. So for example, in English, if we negate a simple clause like Mary saw John, we say Mary didn't see John, that's standard negation. If we use the same negative construction to negate everyone saw John, we get everyone didn't see John, which requires an inverse scope interpretation because negation follows the quantifier, but the intended meaning is that it is not the case that everyone saw John. Negation negates the quantified proposition. And psycholinguistic studies show that inverse scope incurs a processing cost. So a sentence like everyone didn't see John, in the sense that it is not the case that everyone saw John, is more difficult, is relatively difficult to process. And in order to avoid inverse scope, you have to use a different negative construction. Instead of using standard negation, you can use something like not everyone saw John, where you put a negation before the quantifier phrase. So usually clause initial negation is uncommon, but in this case, we see it in many languages because it's used for the purpose of avoiding inverse scope, which is difficult. In some languages, negated quantify phrase constructions are structurally similar to constituent negation constructions where the subject is in focus. So for example, in Hebrew, I can say, not everyone ordered beer, which is a negated quantify phrase construction. And I can also use a similar word order when the subject is a personal pronoun. Not me ordered beer, in the sense that it wasn't me who ordered beer. And the subject has to be in focus in this case. So one might think that the negated quantify phrase constructions are just constituent negation and they're not really constructions of their own right. But in fact, we see that the two constructions are not necessarily related, unlike in Hebrew. English doesn't have constituent negation where the subject is in focus. So you cannot say, not Mary saw John, in the sense that it wasn't Mary who saw John. But you can say, not everyone saw John. You can put negation before the quantifier. And in Hindi, it's the other way around. You can say, you can use constituent negation in a sense like it's not me who eats mango by putting the negative particle after the focus constituent. But you cannot say not everyone eats mango. You cannot put negation in this position. You have to use standard negation and say something equivalent to everyone doesn't eat mango. So we see that these two constructions are not necessarily related. So negated quantifier phrase constructions can be considered constructions of their own right and not just regular constituent negation. So this study aims to answer the following questions. First, what's the typology? Which languages have negated quantifier phrase constructions and which do not? And two, what is the source construction from which these constructions develop? And I will focus on this part in this talk. So negated quantifier phrase constructions are rarely described in grammars. So in order to establish cross-linguistic generalizations, one has to collect primary data. For this purpose, I use translations of the New Testament into 110 languages from around the world. Whenever possible, I use at least 2 different translations for each language to have more data points and that it would be more independent of each other. And for 31 of these languages, historical translations are also available, which is a major advantage of this corpus. The results support a linguistic universal that was previously proposed by Larry Horn in his dissertation and establish 2 novel linguistic universals. So Horn's universal says that no language has a monomorphemic lexeme with the meaning of not all. So there's no language who has something like null. And this lexical gap is interesting in the context of the logical square of opposition, which represents the relations between the 4 basic types of quantificational propositions in Aristotelian logic. So you have propositions like all SRP, which is something like all cats are cute. You have some cats are cute, no cat is cute, and not all cats are cute. So what's important here to notice is that in English and in many other languages, you have 1 word for all, for some, for no, but you need 2 words for not all. And according to this study, this is indeed, I didn't find any counterexample to this universal. And indeed, you always have at least 2 elements, a negative marker and a universal quantifier in this case. I propose the following universal. If a language has a negated quantifier phrase construction, it also allows neg stripping, which I will describe in a moment, with a remaining quantifier phrase, but not vice versa. So neg stripping is an ellipsis construction found mostly in coordination, where everything is deleted from the conjoined clause, except for 1 constituent and the negative marker. And so for instance, some patients hide out while waiting for the hair to grow, but not John. So here the remaining constituent is a proper name, John. But it can also be a quantify phrase. Some of the students live in the dorms, but not all of them. And the verb phrase is elided in this case. So this universal is demonstrated by modern Greek. So in Greek, you can say, and you are clean, though not all of you. This is a neg stripping construction. But you cannot say not all of you are clean. This is totally ungrammatical. So Greek doesn't have a negated quantify phrase construction. So the universal says that you will find languages like Greek, but you won't find the other cases. Case where a language allows this collocation in a independent clause, like not all of you are clean, but you cannot say but not all of you. Another universal says that if a language has a negated quantify phrase construction, the negative marker that is used in this construction is the same marker that is used in neg stripping. And this is demonstrated by Albanians. So in 22a, we have neg stripping and ellipsis construction, though not all of you, and the negative marker is yo. And in 22b, we have an independent clause, a negated quantify phrase construction, but not all have obeyed the good news. So in both cases, the negative marker is yo, and crucially, in standard negation, the negative marker is nuk, so it doesn't have to be like in English that not is used all over the place, but the same marker would be used in these two constructions. I argue that these universals hold because negated quantify phrase constructions develop out of neg stripping constructions. So this explains first why only languages that have a neg stripping construction have a negated quantify phrase construction, because you need to have the source construction in order to have the grammaticalized construction. And the formal similarity between these two constructions, meaning that the same negative marker is used in both cases, and not necessarily the one that's used in standard negation. This scenario is further supported by diachronic evidence from several languages, where you see that the neg stripping construction predates the negated quantify phrase construction. And I will show examples from English and Portuguese. So in Middle English, the use of the negative particle not in standard negation was well established in the 13th century, and in the later 14th century, it became almost obligatory. However, the earliest examples and very rare ones of a negated quantified phrase constructions are from the second half of the 14th century. So for example, not all bishops in name are bishops indeed. So we see that not was used in standard negation for a few hundred years before it started appearing in this position before quantified phrases. And in contrast, stripping constructions are tested as early as the 12th century. This example is from the 13th century. In each man, and there are 3 souls, but not all equally good. And there's no verb here, and so it's an ellipsis construction. So we see that the stripping construction predates the negated quantified phrase construction. Present-day Portuguese is a rare counterexample to universal 2b, which I will repeat. If a language has a negated quantified phrase construction, the negative marker that is used in this construction is the same one that is used in neg stripping. So that's an example of a modern revised version of translation of the New Testament. So in 26c, we have a neg stripping construction, and we see that the negative marker is a noun, which is the same one that is used in standard negation. But in a negated quantified phrase construction, we have nem todos. And nem, the basic meaning of nem is not even or neither, but in this case, it's obligatory in a negated quantified phrase construction. So we see that 2 different constructions are used. But in fact, if we go back to the original translation from the 17th century, from which the one we saw before was revised, we saw that the noun and nem are used interchangeably in the negated quantified phrase construction. So we have both noun todos and nem todas, and used interchangeably. And if we go even back further in time, we see that the earliest tested examples of a negated quantify phrase construction use nom, which is a variant of noun. So actually Portuguese is an exception that proves the rule, because we see that originally indeed the same marker was used in both of these constructions, but later for some reason speakers began to use nem, and it took over, and now it's the only option in present day Portuguese. And I don't know why this change happened. To conclude, I argue that negated quantified phrase constructions are not run-of-the-mill considered negation, but constructions of their own right with some special properties, and they developed out of neg stripping constructions. The motivation for developing this construction is avoiding inverse scope, because using standard negation in most languages, in almost all of them, would require an inverse scope interpretation when the subject is a quantifier. So these constructions are a means of avoiding inverse scope. Thank you.
Thank you, Omri. Thank you for actually making it even shorter than what we asked for. So we have plenty of time for questions. I'm trying to see if we have any hand raised. So no, I don't see. If I miss something, just please speak up. In the meantime, I'll ask you a question, maybe. So I see why you assume that developed out of neg stripping, but I mean it looks like a very different phenomenon. So what's the connection? I would ask. So because the neg stripping, we think of, I mean the default explanation will be kind of ellipsis, but do you assume any type of ellipsis with the negated quantifier?
Thank you. So that's a question that I'm still thinking about. If there was some sort of syntactic reanalysis going on. What I think might be crucial is, I'll go back a bit for this reanalysis, is cases like 24. So most of the examples I showed is something like, but not all of them, or something like that. But here you actually have a predicate, and this looks more like an independent clause with a subject and a predicate. And I think that maybe contexts like that are relevant for the type of syntactic reanalysis that's going on, and I still don't know exactly what syntactic reanalysis is really happens here, and I still have to think more about neg stripping and the syntax of.
I mean, the default would be that this is a syntactic, that it's basically neg and p or something like that.
Yeah. So
instead
so
of, but then this is, but then I guess the question will be, to what extent you really see it like as like a broad phenomena, like whether you expect to find such a typology. So the typology is interesting, but then this is like, it looks like an accidental reanalysis, unless I'm missing something.
So
unless you have a stronger motivation, that's my question.
Yeah. So the motivation that I'm suggesting is that this type of construction is helpful because it avoids inverse scope. Because otherwise, if you don't have this construction, then you would have to use inverse scope, which is costly. so I suggested this motivation. So I don't know if it motivates the reanalysis, or maybe reanalysis just goes all of the time, but maybe because it is a useful construction, because it avoids inverse scope, then it becomes more frequent and becomes part of the grammar. Yeah, I don't know how to answer these questions, like what really the mechanism of the changes. Yeah.
We have more questions here. Oh, wait.
Hi, sorry if you might have mentioned it, but you said only half of the languages have these constructions, and I guess I just can't imagine one of those languages that I would know. What do you do when you don't have them? You just say something like, everyone didn't eat and it's ambiguous? Like, what do these languages do? Because presumably they had Greek sentences that had that to translate, right?
So yeah, so what I presented today is actually part of a larger project, so I just focused on this construction. So many languages, so for example, in Hindi, where you don't have this construction, you would say everyone doesn't eat mango, and it would mean that not everyone eats mango. Some languages use clefts, like it's not everyone who eats mango. You also have it in English. It's not super common, but it's also possible in English. And there are languages where you use VS word order and say something like not eats everyone mango, something like that. Yeah, so that's the most common strategies that languages use. Thank you.
So we have a question. Do you see the question in the Q&A? Yasmin Sanchez asks you whether you think that the fact that the examples are translation of ancient text affect the results. Also, can the age of the text affect usage?
Yeah. Okay, so definitely it doesn't, corpus doesn't represent all registers of the language, but what I did to overcome the limitations of this corpus is to see if a translation uses a different construction than the one that's used in the source text. So if the source text uses one construction and translation uses another, then I take it as good evidence that this construction was indeed used in the language. So, but in cases where translation just follows the source very in a very close way, then I didn't consider such translations as good evidence. Yeah, because that would be a problem. But actually, this happens mostly in ancient translations made in antiquity, and modern translation usually are not so don't follow the text as closely. Yeah, usually. Mira?
Mira, please.
You're muted.
Now you have to mute.
Sorry. I'm wondering, what about other quantifiers? So some, okay, maybe different, but what about most? Does that also, what happens when you say most people didn't come? Do you get the interpretation that it's not most, or that most didn't come? And what happens with not most? Not most people came, I don't know. Is it because all is so strong and focal that it attracts negation?
Yeah, well, most is tricky because the difference between not most and most not is very subtle. It's just in the scenario where exactly half of the people, whatever. But for example, not many is also found in many languages, but it's not as common as not all. And so, for example, we saw in Portuguese that they have a form for not all, but they don't have a form for not many. So, and I think what happens in Portuguese, and I think in many languages, is that you can use a negative existential. Like there aren't many people who want to live in the city or something like that, which you cannot do with a universal quantifier. You cannot say there aren't everyone or something like that. There isn't everyone. And so I think because of the availability of a negative existential, then not many is less common than not all. And you also have languages where you can say like many people don't smoke would mean that not many people smoke, but it's also less common than having inverse scope in sentences like everyone doesn't smoke. And I think in both cases, it's perhaps because the existential is available.
But do you think the same source is responsible for not many, not few, not whatever?
I think, but it also might be that it extends from a universal quantifier to other quantifiers. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't studied it actually. Yeah.
Thank you.